Welcome to the channel.
I guess I just need to get this all out there. It's been eating me up, and maybe someone out there's been through something like this. My wife Carly and we were together 13 years, married for 10 of those. We've got 2 amazing kids. I always thought our family was solid, you know? But it turns out, I didn't know half of what was going on right in front of me. It started subtle, almost invisible, like something you sense but can't quite see. Carly had been acting different, putting more effort into how she looked, even when she was just taking the kids to their sports practices or meeting her friends. She'd get these text messages all hours of the day, and every time I'd ask about it, she'd brush it off, saying I was paranoid, accusing me of not trusting her. I guess I didn't want to admit what I already knew. She'd suddenly get calls from a number she'd step out of the room to take. Whenever I asked, she made me feel like I was some jealous fool for even suggesting anything was going on. She knew exactly how to make me feel like the bad guy for asking questions. I wanted to believe her so bad, so I let it slide. Then one day, she casually mentioned this new guy she met at the gym, Lucas. She'd just drop his name here and there like he was no big deal. The way she talked about him though, her voice changed. I know how that sounds, but when you're with someone that long, you pick up on these things. Turns out, Lucas wasn't just some guy at the gym. He was rich, private jets, fancy cars, big house, the whole deal. He wasn't from our world at all. And I started to realize maybe that was exactly what she wanted. I remember this one night she came home late, said she had been out with friends from work. I didn't ask questions because I was afraid of the answers. But then, as she was getting ready for bed, I noticed she wasn't wearing her wedding ring. Just gone. And when I asked her where it was, she barely even paused before telling me she had left it at work. That ring hadn't left her finger in a decade, but suddenly it was just forgotten at work? That's when everything really started unraveling. After that night, I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. Carly's late nights and friends from work excuses started coming more often, and there was something almost rehearsed in the way she'd respond when I'd ask where she'd been. I remember one weekend she took the kids to the beach with her sister, or so she said. She even sent me a few pictures of them splashing in the waves, but when I called her to say goodnight to the kids, her phone went straight to voicemail. 4 hours. The next morning, she came home looking exhausted. The kids ran into the house excited, telling me about the nice man they met who had bought them ice cream. When I asked her who it was, she brushed it off, saying it was just a friendly guy they met on the boardwalk. But I couldn't help but wonder if that nice man was Lucas. A few days later, things really started to slip. Carly was usually pretty guarded with her phone, but one morning, she left it unlocked on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. I know, it sounds terrible, but I picked it up. And there it was, like a gut punch I could see coming but couldn't avoid. A string of messages from Lucas, calling her babe, telling her how much he missed her, how he couldn't wait to see her again. There was even a picture of them together, taken at some fancy restaurant, her hand in his, both of them laughing. Like she was living this whole other life I knew nothing about. When I confronted her that night, she didn't deny it. She barely even looked guilty. Instead, she turned it around, telling me how I'd been too wrapped up in work, too distant, and how Lucas actually made her feel seen and valued. Like somehow her sneaking around with this rich guy was my fault. She even said she deserved some happiness, and that maybe we had grown apart without realizing it. It was like I was some stranger who had walked in on her life and didn't have a right to be upset. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, she told me that Lucas wanted to be a part of her and the kids' lives. He's willing to help, she said, almost like she was doing me a favor. That's when it hit me, she wasn't just leaving me. She was planning to take the kids too. The next couple of weeks were a nightmare. Carly packed up her things and moved in with Lucas, taking the kids along like they were just another part of her baggage. Suddenly, I was alone in the house we'd made a home together, my kids now living with some stranger who swooped in and took my whole life. She filed for divorce before I could even process what was happening, and just like that, we were at war in court over custody. Every time I tried to talk to the kids, Carly was there, twisting my words, saying things to make them feel like I had somehow failed them. I could see it in their eyes when we met for visits. They looked at me differently, distant, like they didn't know me anymore. She was poisoning them against me, making sure they saw me as the problem. And no matter how hard I fought, it was like everything was stacked against me. Court became a battlefield. I walked in there thinking I'd get a fair shot, but the lawyer Carly had, slick, expensive, probably paid for by Lucas, knew exactly what to say to paint me as the distant, uninvolved dad. It was like they'd crafted a story where I was the reason everything fell apart. Carly sat there, perfectly composed, playing the part of the doting mother who had just fallen out of love. And Lucas? I never saw him there, but his money and influence were everywhere. At one point, her lawyer claimed I had a volatile temper, something Carly said made the kids nervous. I was stunned. I'm not an angry guy. I'd never so much as raised my voice at her, let alone the kids. But the judge looked at me with this narrowed stare, like maybe he'd heard it all before. It was like I was being put on trial for things I never did, while Carly sat across the room pretending I was some monster. I didn't recognize the woman she'd become. The hardest part, though, was the way the kids were starting to believe her lies. She had them thinking I was unpredictable, unreliable, even though I'd been there every step of the way, at every game, every recital. But when I got them for weekend visits, they'd be distant, like they were just waiting to go back home, to Carly and Lucas. They'd talk about Lucas's mansion, the pool, his fancy car, things I could never give them. And in their young minds, I could see them comparing. They looked at my house like it was a downgrade. One night, after I dropped them off, I found myself sitting in their empty bedrooms, staring at the toys they'd left behind, the beds they hadn't slept in for weeks. I realized that Carly's goal was never just to leave me. She wanted to erase me. She wanted me out of the kids' lives, so they'd eventually forget what it was like to have a real dad. And it was working. The divorce dragged on, but eventually, Carly got what she wanted, primary custody. I was left with every other weekend and some holidays, basically the bare minimum. My kids were slipping away from me, not just physically but emotionally too. Whenever I tried to talk to them on the phone, it was quick, half-hearted responses. I could feel the distance growing, and it was like I was powerless to stop it. And then came the final blow. Carly filed a petition to move the kids permanently to a different state, closer to where Lucas's business was headquartered. The idea of my kids being a plane ride away was like a knife to the gut, but her lawyer made a solid case for better opportunities for them. I fought it with everything I had, but it was like punching a brick wall. The court granted her the right to move them, citing the best interests of the children. Just like that, they were gone. I couldn't stand staying in that house any longer. Everywhere I looked, I saw memories of a life that was just gone. The walls felt hollow, the rooms felt empty. That's when I decided, if I was going to lose everything, I needed to get as far away from that pain as possible. So I put everything into storage, booked a one-way ticket to Europe, and decided to leave. I told myself it was time to find some kind of peace, even if it meant leaving behind the last pieces of what used to be my life. And that's how I found myself alone, standing in a crowded airport in Paris with nothing but a suitcase and a head full of memories I was desperate to escape. Paris was supposed to be the first stop on a whirlwind trip through Europe, but honestly, I didn't have much of a plan. I'd booked a cheap little room in Montmartre, up near the old Artists' Square. The whole area had this worn, nostalgic feel, like a place that held memories and let them sit quietly instead of forcing them out. It felt fitting somehow. I spent the first few days walking. Just me, a pair of sneakers, and a city I barely knew. I'd wander through little side streets, eat at tiny cafes, sit along the Seine, and watch as people lived their lives. Normal lives, happy lives. In Paris, I was just another stranger, a ghost in the crowd, free of all the baggage I'd left behind in Australia. I needed that anonymity. But every night, the weight of everything would catch up with me. I'd sit alone in my room, staring at photos on my phone, my kids, their old drawings I'd snapped over the years, their faces from happier times. I tried not to let it break me, but some nights it did. I couldn't help feeling like I was drowning, trying to keep my head above water in a place that was supposed to be my escape. And then one night, everything changed. I was at this small wine bar tucked away from the main street, a place with more locals than tourists. I'd ordered a glass of red, trying to make it last, staring out the window and getting lost in the familiar ache of missing my kids. That's when I noticed her. She was sitting a few tables away, dark hair, eyes that held a hint of sadness, and this quiet strength about her. She was reading, occasionally glancing around the room, and our eyes met for a split second before we both looked away. Something about her caught my attention, not in a romantic way at first, more in a we've both been through something kind of way. Eventually, she moved over to the bar, right next to where I was sitting, and she smiled. "Bonsoir," she said, that gentle French accent thick in her voice. I gave a small nod back, not wanting to intrude. She didn't press, just ordered her drink and sipped it in comfortable silence. But after a few minutes, she turned to me again, her eyes meeting mine. "You look like someone with a heavy heart," she said, her words soft but direct. I could have brushed it off, but there was something sincere in the way she said it. So for the first time in what felt like forever, I actually opened up. We talked for hours that night. Her name was Juliette, a French woman with a story of her own, a messy divorce, a family split up, the same scars from betrayal that I carried. She understood in a way I hadn't expected anyone to. She didn't pity me or offer solutions. She just listened, nodding in all the right places, as if she knew exactly what I was feeling. Over the next few weeks, Juliette and I started meeting regularly. We'd explore the city together, talk about everything and nothing at all, sometimes in French, sometimes in broken English. With her, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in ages. We weren't trying to fix each other, we were just two people leaning on each other, healing in small, quiet ways. And slowly, almost without realizing it, my days started feeling lighter. We took a few trips outside Paris, to quiet villages in Provence and to the coast where the sea stretched out into the horizon. I could feel myself letting go of the bitterness, little by little, as if every step we took was putting distance between me and the life I'd left behind. One night, as we sat on the beach watching the sunset, Juliette reached for my hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like a bridge between the life I'd lost and this new one that was starting to unfold. She looked at me, and for the first time, I let myself imagine a future, something different from what I'd once dreamed of, but still something that felt right. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized I hadn't thought of Carly or Lucas in days. I wasn't forgetting my kids, but I was finally starting to let go of the anger. And in that moment, I knew my journey was only just beginning. After that night on the beach, things with Juliette grew naturally, like two people who were simply meant to find each other. It was quiet, but solid. Every day, I'd wake up a little lighter, a little more focused on the present rather than the past. She was giving me a reason to feel alive again, to see a future that was mine to build, not one tied to the wreckage Carly had left behind. Juliette introduced me to places that became almost like second homes. There was a little bakery near her apartment, run by an older couple who knew her by name. We'd stop there most mornings, getting fresh pastries and chatting with the owners in our broken mix of English and French. It was a small thing, but it became a routine, grounding me in this new life we were piecing together. Each day felt like I was rebuilding the pieces of myself that had been shattered. We spent a lot of time exploring the countryside. One weekend, Juliette took me to her family's old vineyard, a place she hadn't been in years since her own heartbreak. Her family had lost it in her divorce, but she loved it too much to stay away. We wandered through the rows of grapevines, and she told me stories about her childhood, about picking grapes with her cousins and staying up late under the stars. The warmth of her memories made me feel like I was a part of them, like I belonged in her world. I couldn't help but think back to my own kids on those days, wondering what memories Carly was planting in their minds. I missed them, missed being a dad who was actually there for them. I'd try to call, but my conversations with them were getting shorter, colder. Carly had clearly been filling their heads with stories about my abandonment. I'd tell them I missed them, that I loved them, but they'd barely respond, their voices distant. It hurt, but I was learning to accept that I couldn't change it, not from so far away. Juliette seemed to sense the ache in me, and she never pushed me to talk about it. Instead, she'd pull me closer, always reminding me that love could be steady, quiet, and without strings. And as time passed, I realized that being with her was helping me let go of the idea that I'd somehow lost. I hadn't lost anything, I'd been given a chance to start over. One evening, sitting on her tiny Paris balcony, I looked over at her and finally put words to something I hadn't been ready to say. "What if I don't want to go back to the life I had?" I asked, barely louder than a whisper. Juliette looked at me, her face soft in the dim light, and took my hand. She didn't say anything for a moment, just let me hold on to that thought, like it was a fragile bird we didn't want to scare away. "You don't have to go back, Mark," she said, finally. "Maybe this is where your life is meant to go." Over time, that idea settled in, and it began to shape my decisions. We traveled more, to Italy and Spain, sharing moments I hadn't even thought were possible for me again. Juliette's love was unlike anything I'd known. It was free of drama, steady and kind, something I never knew I'd been missing. She showed me a love that didn't take, only gave. And somewhere between those cobbled streets and quiet nights, I realized I was falling deeply in love with her. By the time spring came, It felt as if we were building a life together, one that didn't need to be defined by the past. We spent our days together, lost in new cities, slowly talking about what the future could look like. Juliet's family became my family in a way, welcoming me without question. I felt like I'd found a place to belong again, maybe not the one I'd originally planned for, but one that was beautiful in its own way. And then one quiet night in the south of France, sitting under the stars, Juliet told me she loved me. Those words settled in my heart, and for the first time in years, I realized I could actually see a future, one filled with peace, maybe even happiness. We made a promise to each other then, that whatever came next, we'd face it together. In that moment, I knew that my journey wasn't just about getting away. It was about starting again, this time with someone who truly understood me. And as I held Juliet's hand under that starry sky, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. Life with Juliet felt like something out of a dream, the kind of peace I didn't think I'd ever have again. We'd settled into a rhythm, days full of laughter and evenings filled with quiet conversations about our pasts, our fears, our hopes. With her, I felt like I was building a new foundation, not the wreckage Carly had left me in, but something steady, honest, and unbreakable. One afternoon, we took a trip to a quiet little village in Provence. Juliet had told me there was a special place there, an old stone church on a hill where people would go to make wishes or leave prayers. She said she hadn't been there since she was a child, but that it had always brought her peace. So we went, climbing the winding path up to the church as the sun began to set. Inside, the walls were covered in tiny notes, wishes and prayers from people all over the world. I could feel the weight of it, the hopes and heartaches people had left there. Juliet reached into her bag, pulling out a small piece of paper and a pen, and handed it to me. "Write something down," she said, her eyes warm. "Something you want for your future." I didn't even need to think about it. I wrote 3 words, a family again. I folded the paper, tucked it into a crevice in the wall, and we sat there in silence for a while, just letting the peace of the place fill us. A few months later, back in Paris, Juliet came to me with a look I hadn't seen before, nervous, hopeful, maybe a little scared. She sat down next to me, took my hand, and in the softest voice she said, "Mark, I'm pregnant." For a moment, I just sat there, stunned. But then, the weight of what she'd said hit me, and I pulled her close, feeling this wave of emotion I couldn't even put into words. She was giving me something I thought I'd lost forever, a chance to be a dad again, to start fresh, to make a family that would be mine in a way nothing had been for years. The next few months were a whirlwind of planning and quiet excitement. We talked about where we wanted to live, and finally, we decided to return to Australia. I wanted my new family to grow up in the same country I had, to have the same sun, the same beaches, the same warmth of the place I'd once called home. But this time, I was going back with something I hadn't had when I left, a fresh start, a future I actually looked forward to. When Juliet and I moved back, I braced myself for the memories that would come flooding back, for the reminders of everything I'd lost. But they never came. Instead, I was met with a strange sense of calm. It was like all the pain I'd carried from that place had been washed away in those months traveling through Europe. I was ready to build something here, something new. Back in Australia, we bought a small house near the coast. Nothing extravagant, just a cozy place with a yard and a big tree in the front that would be perfect for a swing one day. As we settled in, preparing for the arrival of our child, I felt a sense of purpose return to my life, something I hadn't felt in years. I still missed my other kids, of course. That ache didn't just disappear, but it was quieter now. I sent letters and gifts, called when I could, always hoping for a chance to reconnect. But Carly had done her damage. Their responses were cold, distant, almost as if they were writing to a stranger. I had to accept that maybe, no matter how much I loved them, they might never come back to me. But Juliet, she softened that ache. She'd remind me that our child would know me as their dad, that I'd have the chance to be there from the start this time. And every time she said it, I'd feel that heaviness lift just a little more. Then one evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set over the waves, she reached for my hand. "You've given me a family, Mark," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A real one. And I want to make sure you always feel part of it." It hit me then just how far I'd come, from feeling like I'd lost everything to realizing I'd gained so much more. And as I held Juliet's hand, with our new life spreading out before us, I finally felt something I thought I'd never feel again: peace. Juliet and I spent those last months before the baby arrived in a peaceful kind of anticipation. We set up a little nursery, painted the walls a soft blue, and filled it with toys and books we picked up from small shops around town. Every time I walked past that room, I'd feel this deep, quiet pride. It was a fresh start, a chance to do things right. Then one early morning in July, Juliet woke me up, gripping my hand, her eyes wide and a little scared. "Mark, it's time," she whispered, and just like that, we were on our way to the hospital. The whole drive, I kept stealing glances at her, overwhelmed by the fact that this was really happening. My life had shattered and reformed so many times, but now I was here by her side, ready to bring new life into the world. Our son was born a few hours later, his cries filling the room as they placed him in Juliet's arms. I remember looking at his tiny face, his eyes squinting up at us, and feeling this overwhelming surge of love and protectiveness. I leaned down, kissed Juliet's forehead, and whispered, "We did it." She looked up at me, her face glowing with exhaustion and joy, and simply nodded, tears in her eyes. We named him Leo, and from that first night, I felt something inside me shift. Holding him, I could feel the jagged pieces of my old life start to heal over, replaced by something stronger, something whole. Every time he reached for my finger or looked at me with those wide, curious eyes, I felt like I was being given a second chance. It was a gift I'd never expected, and I was determined not to waste it. But as much joy as Leo brought into our lives, there were still shadows that lingered. Every so often, I'd catch myself thinking of my other kids, wondering if they'd ever meet their half-brother, if they'd ever know about this part of my life. I sent them pictures of Leo, wrote letters telling them about their little brother, hoping it might spark something. But Carly had done her job well. I'd get nothing back, no replies, just silence. One day, I got a message from an unknown number. It was a brief text. "Please stop trying to contact them. They've moved on." No signature, but I didn't need one to know it was Carly. I could feel the anger rise up, like a fire reigniting, but I took a deep breath and let it go. She wanted me to break, to react, but I wasn't that man anymore. I had Juliet, I had Leo, and they were my focus now. Juliet noticed when I was quiet, knew when the memories crept in. One night, as we sat on the back porch after putting Leo to bed, she reached over and took my hand. "You're a wonderful father, Mark," she said, squeezing my hand gently. "Leo's lucky to have you. And one day your other children. They'll know who you are, even if it takes time." I nodded, appreciating her words, though a part of me still felt that familiar ache. But I was learning to live with it, to let it be part of me without letting it consume me. Juliet and Leo were my future, my family, and I was determined to give them all of me, the best of me. As Leo grew, I poured myself into fatherhood, taking joy in every little milestone. His first smile, his first laugh, the first time he said, "Dad." Those were moments Carly could never take away from me, pieces of happiness that belonged to me and me alone. And as the months passed, those small joys built up, becoming a shield against the pain of the past. But I knew deep down that the journey wasn't over. I still had wounds that hadn't fully healed, parts of me that hadn't fully let go of the life I'd lost. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: whatever came, I'd face it with Juliet and Leo by my side. And that, I realized, was all the strength I'd ever need. Life with Juliet and Leo settled into something beautiful, like a routine that didn't feel routine at all. Every day was new, filled with Leo's firsts and the quiet, steady love Juliet and I shared. Our small house near the coast became our little haven, and with each project, building Leo a swing in the yard, planting a garden, we were putting down roots, making the place feel like home. But as Leo turned one, the reminders of my past started creeping back in, this time in ways I couldn't ignore. I received a message one morning, a photo of my two older kids, now teenagers, smiling stiffly in what looked like a holiday photo. No note, no explanation, but the sender was Carly. It was the first time in years she'd reached out, and I knew it wasn't by accident. She wanted me to see what I'd been missing, to remind me of the life she had control over. That night, I showed the photo to Juliet, unsure of how I felt. She studied it, then looked at me with a calm understanding. "They're growing up, Mark," she said softly. "They'll make their own choices someday. And when they do, they'll know who you are." She placed her hand on mine, grounding me like she always did. Her words stayed with me, giving me the strength to stay focused on the family I had now. I kept the photo, tucked it away in a drawer, and poured my energy back into Leo and Juliet, realizing I could love and grieve at the same time. The ache for my kids would never fully go away, but it didn't have to define me anymore. In our little house with Juliet and Leo, I was building something new, something Carly couldn't take from me. And maybe, just maybe, one day my kids would find their way back, not to the father Carly had painted, but to the man I'd become. Months passed, and the drawer where I'd tucked away that photo became a kind of ritual, something I'd visit once in a while, just to remember. The kids looked so grown up in that picture, their smiles reserved, almost forced. I could see bits of myself in them, expressions, gestures. It was comforting and painful at the same time, a reminder of what could have been if things had gone differently. One evening, after putting Leo to bed, I was cleaning up when my phone buzzed. Expecting it to be a late message from work or a friend, I unlocked it without a second thought. But when I looked down, my heart skipped. It was from my daughter. Just a simple "Hi, Dad," sent from what looked like a new number. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. I could feel my pulse quicken, hands trembling a bit as I read those two words again and again. It felt like a door opening, one I'd thought was closed forever. I quickly typed back, "Hi, sweetheart. I'm so happy to hear from you," keeping it short, not wanting to overwhelm her. After a minute, a reply came through, "Is it okay if I call you sometime?" It was like a weight lifted. I immediately texted back, "Yes, anytime. I'd love that." Over the next week, my daughter and I started talking more, mostly over messages. She told me about school, her friends, little bits and pieces about her life that felt like treasures after so long. She didn't say much about Carly, and I didn't ask, not wanting to push. Instead, I just listened, responding thoughtfully to every story she shared. I wanted her to feel safe, like she could come to me with anything. When I told Juliet, she hugged me tightly, her eyes warm with encouragement. "This is the start, Mark. Just be there for her, like you always wanted to be." Finally, one evening, my phone rang, and it was her. Hearing her voice again, a bit older, more grown up, brought back so many memories. I asked her about school, her hobbies, even her favorite TV shows, all things I never thought I'd get the chance to know. She was shy at first, but as the conversation flowed, I could feel her relaxing, laughing at my jokes, even teasing me a bit. Then, as our call wound down, she asked quietly, "Dad, do you miss me and Jake?" Her voice was small, uncertain. My heart twisted, but I kept my voice steady. "Every single day," I told her. "I never stopped thinking about you both. Not once. You're my kids, and I love you. That hasn't changed." There was a long silence, then a soft, "I miss you too." It was like a balm on an old wound, one that had never fully healed. I knew she wasn't ready to talk about seeing me or reconnecting in person, but this was enough for now. It was more than I'd had in years. When I hung up, I sat there for a while, staring out into the dark, feeling a strange mix of joy and sadness. It was a beginning, a small, tentative one, but still a beginning. And I was ready to take it slow, to be there whenever my daughter was ready to let me back into her life. Because in the end, no matter how far life had taken me, I'd always be her dad. For the first time in years, I had a connection with my daughter, a small, fragile one but real. We texted here and there, just little things, her favorite subjects, her soccer games, and funny things her friends said. Every time I saw her name pop up on my phone, it was like a piece of my old life was returning. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. I never pushed, careful to let her reach out on her own terms. But with that connection came Carly. She called out of the blue one afternoon, her voice sharp and guarded. "So, you've been talking to our daughter?" I held back, keeping my tone even. "Yes," she reached out. "I've missed her, Carly, and Jake too." "Don't act like the past didn't happen, Mark," she shot back. "You were the one who left." I felt that old, familiar anger flare up. "You know that's not true, Carly. I had no choice. You took them and made me the villain." Silence. I could almost hear her seething on the other end. "Well, don't confuse her with your version of things. She's doing fine without you." That stung, but I stayed calm. "I'm not here to rewrite history. I just want a relationship with my kids. That's it." She let out a bitter laugh. "Fine. But don't expect too much. You left this family long ago, and I'm not about to let you barge back in and mess things up." The call ended on a sour note, but I was determined not to let Carly's words throw me off. I knew she was protecting her version of things, the one she'd used to build this wall between me and the kids. But I wasn't the man she'd painted me to be, and I hoped that, over time, my daughter would see that too. A few days later, I told Juliet about the call. She was quiet for a moment, then reached for my hand. She can't stop them from knowing who you are, Mark. Keep being steady, keep showing up in the way you can, and they'll see the truth eventually. Her support meant everything. It gave me strength to keep reaching out, even when Carly tried to make things difficult. And as the weeks went by, I could feel my daughter's trust building. She even shared a few old memories, days we spent at the beach, movie nights, the little things that had made us close once. I held onto those memories, weaving them into this new relationship we were forming, one slow, patient step at a time. But I still hadn't heard from my son, Jake. Each message I sent him went unanswered, each attempt to reach him met with silence. I knew he was likely caught between loyalty to his mom and the memory of the dad he'd lost, and I couldn't blame him for that. He was still young, still under Carly's influence. All I could do was hope he'd come around in time. And so, with Juliet and Leo by my side, I held on to what I had. I focused on being present, on giving Leo the best of me and waiting for the day my older kids might be ready to take a chance on me again. It was a long road, but I finally felt like I was moving forward, even if only by inches. And sometimes, that was all I needed. Months passed, and my connection with my daughter grew steadily, her texts coming in more often, our phone calls longer and warmer. She started sharing details about her life, her classes, her favorite books, the shows she was into. It felt like I was getting to know her all over again, like rebuilding a friendship one layer at a time. But Jake still hadn't reached out. I told myself to be patient, to keep showing up for my daughter, and that maybe he'd follow in his own time. Then one rainy Saturday afternoon, I got a message that took me by surprise. "Dad, can we meet?" Just us. My heart leapt. She'd never asked to see me in person before, and the fact that she wanted it, without Carly knowing, felt huge. I replied immediately, arranging to meet at a small cafe in town the next day. I barely slept that night, excitement and nerves keeping me awake. Juliet noticed, of course. She squeezed my hand as we lay in bed, her voice soft in the dark. "She's ready, Mark. Just be there for her, that's all you need to do." The next morning, I arrived early, heart pounding as I watched the door. And then there she was. My daughter walked in, her familiar smile shy but warm, her hair a little longer than I remembered, and the look in her eyes softer than before. She sat down across from me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other, a thousand unsaid things between us. We started with small talk, but soon she opened up, surprising me with how much she'd been holding back. She told me about her life, her friends, the school projects she was working on. She even shared some frustrations with Carly's strict rules, saying she sometimes felt like she had to be someone she wasn't around her mom. I just listened, nodding, letting her know I was there for whatever she wanted to share. Then she took a deep breath, looking down at her coffee. "Dad, why did you really leave?" Her voice was quiet, uncertain, like she'd wanted to ask that question for a long time. My chest tightened, but I met her gaze, determined to be honest. "I didn't want to leave, sweetheart. I never wanted to be away from you and Jake. But when your mom and I separated, things got complicated. She wanted a fresh start, and I lost you in the process. I tried to fight for more time with you, but it didn't go the way I'd hoped." She was quiet, processing. I watched her, worried I'd said too much or not enough. But after a moment, she reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. "I know you tried, Dad. I believe you." I felt a weight lift, one I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. She was giving me a second chance, an opening I'd thought I might never get. We spent hours at that cafe, talking and laughing, like no time had passed. When it was time for her to go, she hugged me tight, and I felt all the broken pieces inside me start to come back together. As I watched her walk away, I knew there was still a long road ahead with Jake, and Carly would make things harder before they got easier. But that meeting gave me hope. My daughter was seeing me for who I truly was, and in that moment, I knew I'd do whatever it took to keep that door open. The day after my meeting with my daughter, I kept replaying our conversation, every word, every moment. It was like a balm on an old wound, a reminder that there was still hope for a relationship with my kids. But as grateful as I was, I knew the other half of my heart still ached for my son. Jake had been silent, distant, unreachable, and it was beginning to feel like I'd lost him completely. But then one evening, out of the blue, I got a message from him. Just a simple, blunt text. "Why did you leave us?" My stomach twisted reading it, the words sharp and angry in a way I hadn't felt for my daughter. I could tell he'd heard Carly's version of things, probably had it repeated 100 times over the years. And he was hurting, angry, blaming me for everything that had happened. I stared at the screen, wondering how to respond, knowing this moment was important. I wanted to say everything, to explain the court battles, the things Carly had done, the way I'd been kept out. But I stopped myself. Jake didn't need an explanation that would put him in the middle of his parents' mess. He just needed the truth in its simplest form. I typed back, "I never wanted to leave, Jake. I always wanted to be with you and your sister, but things got complicated. I'm here for you, always, if you ever want to talk." And I left it at that, hoping it would be enough to show him I cared, that I'd always care. For a while, there was no reply. I tried to keep busy, keep my mind off the possibility that my answer had made things worse. I helped Juliet put Leo to bed, and we sat on the couch, her head on my shoulder, a quiet comfort in her presence. She didn't need to ask, she knew. Then later that night, my phone buzzed again. It was Jake. "I don't know if I believe you." I felt a pang, but I kept my response gentle. "That's okay, Jake. I just want you to know I'm here, and I always will be, no matter what." I didn't expect a response after that, but I hoped that my words might slowly chip away at the anger he was holding on to. The next day, I got another message from him. This time, it was a little longer, and the tone was different. "I don't get why things turned out this way, but I'll keep talking to you. I just need time." Reading that, I felt a spark of relief. He wasn't ready to forgive, maybe didn't even understand yet what he wanted from me. But he was willing to give me a chance to try. And that was all I could have asked for. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I exchanged more messages, slowly, carefully. He'd ask questions, and I'd answer honestly, without dragging him into the past that Carly had created between us. And with each text, each small conversation, I felt a connection forming again, like I was slowly breaking through the walls Carly had built. One night, I showed Juliet his messages. She read them and then looked at me, her face full of encouragement. "Keep going, Mark. He's finding his way back to you." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could bring my family back together, even if it was one fragile piece at a time. As the weeks went on, Jake's messages became longer, warmer, like he was letting down his guard, bit by bit. We'd talk about his school projects, his soccer games, the music he was into. He asked me about my life in Australia, and I told him about Juliet and Leo, about our house by the coast. I could feel his curiosity, his interest growing, though he never fully let his guard down. But I kept showing up, responding with care, letting him set the pace. Then one afternoon, a text came through that made my heart skip a beat. "Can I come visit you?" It was as straightforward as could be, but the meaning behind it hit me hard. He wanted to see me, to see this life I'd built, to see the father he hadn't known for so many years. I immediately texted back, "I would love that, Jake." A few weeks later, I picked him up at the airport. He looked taller than I remembered, more grown up, his expression a mix of nerves and curiosity. I felt a pang, realizing just how much I'd missed in the years since he'd been gone. But I pushed those regrets aside, focusing on the fact that he was here, willing to spend time with me. We drove in near silence to my house, the radio filling the quiet as he looked out the window, taking in the unfamiliar landscape. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Juliet and Leo were waiting on the porch. I could see Jake's eyes flicker with something like surprise when he saw them, but he quickly covered it, nodding politely as I introduced him. That evening, we had dinner together, and I felt the tension start to ease. Juliet's warmth worked its usual magic, helping Jake feel at ease. Leo, too young to fully understand the complexity of it all, quickly started treating Jake like an instant older brother, chatting away, showing him his toys, sharing his stories. I watched Jake soften, watched him smile and laugh, a side of him I hadn't seen since he was little. After dinner, I suggested we take a walk down to the beach, just the two of us. As we walked along the shoreline, I felt the familiar ache of everything I wanted to say but couldn't quite put into words. I didn't want to push him, but there was one thing I needed him to know. "Jake, I'm sorry for everything that happened," I said quietly, looking out over the waves. "I know you don't understand all of it, and I don't expect you to. But I need you to know that leaving you and your sister was never my choice. I loved you both too much for that." He was quiet, staring down at the sand, kicking a small stone with his shoe. "It just didn't make sense to me. Mom told us things that made it sound like you didn't want to be around." His voice was barely more than a whisper, but I could hear the hurt in it. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I know she told you things, Jake. And I don't want to take that from you. But I want you to know that I fought for you, that I tried. And I always thought about you. Every day. He looked at me, his eyes searching, vulnerable. Did you ever think about what it would be like if we'd stayed together? The question caught me off guard, but I nodded. Every single day. And I still do. I know things are different now, but I'd like to make things right with you, if you'll let me. For a long moment, he just stood there processing. And then, to my surprise, he stepped closer, awkwardly but sincerely, and hugged me. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly, feeling the years of distance and silence start to fade. That night, as we walked back to the house, I knew that things weren't fixed, not entirely. But I also knew that we'd taken the first real step toward healing. Jake was here, and for the first time, I believed he was truly seeing me, not the version of me Carly had painted, but the dad who'd never stopped loving him. After that hug on the beach, something shifted between Jake and me. He was still guarded, but I could feel him opening up, testing this new reality where he could talk to me without any walls between us. The rest of his visit was full of small, meaningful moments, catching him laughing with Leo over breakfast, watching him help Juliet in the kitchen, going on long walks where he'd ask me more about my life now, his curiosity finally starting to show. One evening, we were sitting on the back porch after a family dinner. The sky was dark, the stars bright, and Leo had fallen asleep on my lap. Jake glanced over, looking at Leo with a thoughtful expression. "You really love him, don't you?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked down at Leo's sleeping face, then back at Jake. "I do. Just like I love you and your sister. It's different with Leo because I'm here for all of it, every day. But that doesn't mean I loved you any less. I just missed a lot." Jake was quiet, staring out at the stars. After a while, he said, "Mom always made it sound like you had moved on, like you didn't care." He paused, his voice catching slightly. I guess I started to believe her. Hearing that hurt, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I leaned forward, careful with my words. "I know that's what she wanted you to think, Jake. And I don't blame you for believing her. But I never moved on from you. Even when I couldn't be there, you and your sister were always with me, every single day." He nodded slowly, processing my words. Then he turned to me, his face open, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. "I think I needed to hear that," he said quietly. In that moment, I felt the years of bitterness, the misunderstandings, the pain of separation start to fade. Jake was starting to see me not as the man his mother had described, but as the dad who had always wanted to be there. I reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder, and he didn't pull away. The rest of his visit was filled with more of these small healing moments. We went fishing, spent afternoons at the beach, and talked about the things he'd been holding back. He even asked me if he could come back to visit in a few months, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, like I was finally getting my family back. On the last day of his visit, as I drove him back to the airport, Jake turned to me with a smile, hesitant but real. "Thanks for being honest with me, Dad. I needed that. And I'll come back soon." Hearing him call me Dad like that, with warmth in his voice, was more than I'd ever hoped for. As he walked into the terminal, I felt a mix of sadness and gratitude, knowing I'd finally regained a piece of what I'd lost. When I got home, Juliet was waiting for me with open arms, holding Leo in one arm. I pulled them both close, the family I'd built alongside the family I was beginning to heal. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was whole again. Jake's visit left a sense of peace in the house. Even after he left, I could still feel his presence, a reminder that the past could be mended, that maybe I hadn't lost everything after all. I kept texting him, and he actually replied, sharing updates from school, his soccer games, even the occasional joke. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and I held onto every word. One weekend, my daughter joined in on a call with Jake. We laughed together, sharing stories from the past and new memories from my life with Juliet and Leo. I could feel something beautiful and steady beginning to form, something I'd thought was lost forever. They were getting to know me again, seeing my life beyond what they'd been told. And for the first time, they were choosing to stay connected. Juliet noticed the change too. One evening, she handed me a small box, a thoughtful smile on her face. Inside was a simple silver photo frame, empty and ready. "For when we're all together again," she said softly. Her belief in that moment was a gift, a quiet reminder that I could look forward to the future instead of fearing it. As I placed the frame on the shelf, I realized that while things with my kids weren't fully healed, there was something worth fighting for again. I'd keep showing up, keep reaching out. And one day, maybe we'd fill that frame with a picture of us all together, a family, whole in our own way, finally at peace with the past.
Bye.